Did you know that nearly 40% of people in minority communities report feeling targeted by law enforcement? It's a sobering statistic, but what's even more shocking is how often these encounters escalate into incidents that could have been avoided. Now, imagine this: a young, overconfident cop plants drugs on someone during a routine stop. Outrageous, right? But what if the person wasn't just anyone? What if he was a black police captain with a spotless record and a dashcam to prove his innocence? This is the story of Captain Kofi Mensah, a man who dedicated his life to serving justice, only to find himself a victim of the very system he sought to protect. It's a tale of resilience, accountability, and one man's fight to spark change in the face of injustice. The night began like any other. Kofi, dressed casually after a long shift, stopped at a gas station on his way home. The air was cool, the parking lot quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of traffic. Across the lot, Officer Ethan Wright sat in his patrol car, scanning the scene with a mix of boredom and impatience. When he saw Kofi step out of his sleek black sedan, something shifted in him. To Ethan, Kofi didn't look like a police captain. He looked suspicious. And that's when Ethan made his move. Kofi Mensah was the kind of man people looked up to. Born in Kumasi, Ghana, he grew up in a close-knit family that valued hard work and integrity above all else. His parents often told him, "Kofi, you must always stand for what is right, even when it's hard." Those words shaped him, guiding him through every challenge he faced. When he immigrated to the United States as a teenager, Kofi quickly realized that standing for what was right wasn't always easy. He saw injustice everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, and especially in the criminal justice system. But instead of becoming bitter, he became determined. Joining the police force was his way of making a difference. Over 2 decades, he rose through the ranks, earning the respect of his peers and the love of his community. Kofi was known for his calm demeanor, his unwavering sense of fairness, and his ability to diffuse even the most volatile situations. Ethan Wright, on the other hand, was everything Kofi wasn't. Young, inexperienced, and eager to prove himself, Ethan had joined the force with a chip on his shoulder. He was ambitious, yes, but his ambition often outpaced his judgment. It started with a glance. Ethan, parked at the edge of the gas station lot, saw Kofi step out of his car and walk toward the store. To Ethan, something about the scene felt off. Maybe it was the nice car. Maybe it was the way Kofi carried himself, with quiet confidence, the kind that made Ethan feel small by comparison. As Kofi disappeared into the store, Ethan made a snap decision. Reaching into his glove compartment, he pulled out a small bag of drugs, a leftover from an earlier bust. He stepped out of his patrol car, glancing around to make sure no one was watching, and approached Kofi's vehicle. With practiced ease, he tucked a bag near the rear bumper, just out of sight. Inside the store, Kofi paid for his items and exchanged pleasantries with the cashier. He had no idea that outside, his life was about to change. The flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror minutes later. License and registration, Ethan barked as he approached Kofi's window. Kofi handed over the documents without hesitation. His calm demeanor masked the simmering frustration beneath. He'd been here before, not as a suspect, but as a black man in America. When Ethan returned holding the bag of drugs, triumph written all over his face, Kofi felt a pang of disappointment deeper than words could express. "Is this a joke?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan's smirk faltered, but he pressed on. "Step out of the car, sir. You're under arrest for possession of illegal substances." The cool night air felt heavy as Kofi stepped out of his car, his hands raised slightly to diffuse any unnecessary tension. Officer Ethan Wright stood stiffly by, his posture an awkward mix of confidence and uncertainty. Kofi's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him, like a fire that refused to catch despite his efforts to fan it. "Backup is on the way," Ethan said, as if trying to reassure himself as much as assert authority. Kofi nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Good. I think we'll both benefit from some additional oversight tonight." It wasn't. Kofi's calmness carried weight. His words, delivered with quiet authority, seemed to chip away at Ethan's confidence. For a moment, the younger officer avoided eye contact, his gaze darting between the ground and the flashing lights of his patrol car. Minutes later, 2 additional patrol cars pulled up, their sirens fading as they parked. The officer stepped out cautiously, scanning the scene. Leading them was Sergeant Kwame Adai, a seasoned officer with a reputation for fairness and an unshakable moral compass. Kwame's eyes immediately locked onto Kofi, and recognition flickered across his face. "Captain Mensah." Kwame's voice carried both surprise and concern. Kofi nodded slightly. "Evening, Sergeant. It seems there's been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Quame's brows furrowed. What's going on here? He asked, turning to Ethan, who straightened up, trying to look composed. Suspected drug possession, Ethan said firmly, though his voice carried a slight tremor. He held up the small bag of drugs like evidence in a courtroom. I found this on his vehicle during a routine inspection. Quame's face darkened, and he turned back to Kofi, his tone more measured now. Captain, is there anything you'd like to say? Kofi gestured toward his car with a calm hand. I would recommend reviewing the footage from my dashcam, Sergeant. It will provide all the clarity we need. Quame's expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and unease. He nodded toward one of the backup officers. Retrieve the dashcam. The officer quickly moved to Kofi's car, removing the small device from its mount and handing it to Kwame. The group of officers huddled together as Kwame connected the dashcam to a portable monitor. As the footage began to play, the tension in the air became almost tangible. The screen illuminated with crisp footage, showing Kofi entering the gas station while Ethan's patrol car idled in the distance. Then came the pivotal moment, Ethan stepping out, the bag of drugs visible in his hand as he approached Kofi's vehicle. The officers watched in stunned silence as he crouched by the rear bumper, tucking the bag into place before returning to his car. The playback was damning. The timestamp on the footage aligned perfectly with the timeline of events Ethan had described. The room's silence was broken only by the faint hum of the monitor. Quame's jaw tightened as he looked up from the screen. His eyes bore into Ethan with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The hell is this, right? He demanded, his voice sharp. Ethan stammered, his earlier confidence now shattered. I don't know, it's not what it looks like. Kwame cut him off, his tone icy. Save it. You were caught red-handed, and there's no spinning this. Kofi remained silent, his face unreadable as he observed the unfolding drama. He didn't need to speak, his dashcam had done the talking for him. Right, Kwame said, stepping closer to the younger officer, hand over your weapon. You're suspended effective immediately pending an internal investigation. Ethan's face drained of color as he fumbled to unholster his firearm, handing it over with shaking hands. He opened his mouth to protest again, but Kwame raised a hand to silence him. As Ethan was escorted to a nearby patrol car, Kofi stood quietly, his hands clasped behind his back. On the surface, he appeared calm, but inside, his thoughts churned like a storm. He had seen misconduct during his career, but to be the target of such blatant corruption felt like a betrayal, not just of him, but of the ideals he had dedicated his life to defending. He thought about his family, Emma, his wife, who had always believed in him, Ayo, his teenage daughter, who looked up to him as a role model, and Kojo, his young son, who proudly told his friends that his dad was a hero. How could he explain to them that even someone in his position wasn't immune to prejudice and abuse of power? Captain Mensah, Kwame said, breaking into Kofi's thoughts. His tone was softer now, apologetic. I'm sorry this happened to you. I'll make sure this is handled appropriately. Kofi nodded, his voice measured as he replied. Thank you, Sergeant. But this isn't just about me. This is about the culture that allowed this to happen. That's what needs to change. Quame's gaze softened. You're right, Captain. And I'll back you every step of the way. The following day, word of the incident spread like wildfire. The leaked dashcam footage made its way onto social media, sparking outrage. Community leaders, activists, and residents flooded the precincts with calls demanding accountability. Local news outlets picked up the story, running headlines like, Black police captain targeted by a rogue officer in systemic bias exposed in shocking incident. At home, Kofi sat with Amma at the kitchen table as they watched the news coverage. She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Are you okay? She asked softly. I'm fine, Kofi replied, though his voice carried a note of weariness. But this is just the beginning. The fight for justice doesn't end with clearing my name, Amma nodded, her expression resolute. Then we'll fight together. In the days that followed, rallies were organized across the city. Ayo, a local teacher and community activist, took the lead in mobilizing the community. At one rally, she addressed a crowd of hundreds, her voice ringing with passion. This isn't just about Captain Mensah, she said, her words amplified by a microphone. This is about every black man, woman, and child who has been profiled, targeted, and dehumanized. If a decorated police captain can be treated like this, what chance do the rest of us have? It's time for accountability. It's time for change. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Kofi watched from the sidelines, a mix of pride and humility washing over him. He had always believed in the power of community, and now, that power was on full display. The investigation into Officer Ethan Wright began immediately. Internal Affairs wasted no time reviewing the evidence, and the dashcam footage proved to be a smoking gun. Within days, Ethan was officially suspended without pay, pending further action. Sitting in the sterile interrogation room, Ethan fidgeted nervously as two senior investigators questioned him. The once confident officer now looked small, his posture slouched and his hands trembling slightly. The fluorescent lights above cast an unflattering glare on his pale, sweaty face. "What were you thinking, Wright?" one of the investigators asked, his voice filled with incredulity. "You planted evidence on a decorated captain. Did you think you wouldn't get caught?" Ethan stammered, struggling to string together a coherent response. I thought," he trailed off, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time." The investigator slammed his hand on the table, causing Ethan to flinch. "The right thing to do? You undermined the integrity of this department. You betrayed the oath you swore to uphold." Ethan's head dropped, and for the first time, he seemed to fully grasp the magnitude of his actions. "I wasn't thinking," he murmured. I wanted to make an arrest, to prove I was doing something." The lead investigator leaned forward, his tone cold and firm. "You didn't just make a mistake, Wright. You committed a crime. Evidence tampering. Abuse of power. Do you have any idea what this means for you?" Ethan nodded slowly, his face ashen. "I do," he said, his voice hollow. Meanwhile, Captain Kofi Mensah continued his work at the precinct, even as the fallout from the incident dominated headlines. His colleagues treated him with a newfound reverence, their respect for him deepened by his unwavering composure in the face of adversity. One afternoon, Kofi met with Chief Obeng in his office to discuss the ongoing investigation and the broader implications for the department. "Kofi," the chief began, leaning forward in his chair, "I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for what happened. This department failed you, and for that, I take full responsibility." Kofi nodded, appreciating the chief's sincerity. "Thank you, Chief. But this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else, whether they're wearing a badge or not." The chief sighed, his expression grave. "You're right. We need to make changes, and we need to make them now. I want you to take the lead on implementing a reform program. Start with bias training, community outreach, and stronger accountability measures. Whatever you need, you'll have my full support." Kofi's gaze was steady. "I'll do it. But it's going to take more than programs to fix this. It's going to take commitment, from everyone." While Kofi worked behind the scenes, the community continued to rally in his support. Town hall meetings became weekly events, with residents sharing their own experiences of profiling and mistreatment. Ayo, the teacher and activist who had become a leading voice in the movement, often facilitated these gatherings. At one particularly emotional meeting, a young man named Kwesi stood up to speak. "I grew up in this neighborhood," Kwesi said, his voice shaking. "I've been stopped by the police more times than I can count. They never see me for who I am, a student, a son, a friend. They just see a threat. What happened to Captain Mensah? It could have been me. It could have been any of us." The room fell silent as Kwesi's words sank in. Then, slowly, people began to clap, their applause growing louder and more unified. Kofi, sitting quietly in the back, felt a swell of pride. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger, a community coming together to demand change. Weeks later, Ethan Wright faced formal charges of evidence tampering and misconduct. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and community members, all eager to see justice served. Kofi was present, sitting in the gallery with Amma by his side. He watched as Ethan, now a shadow of his former self, stood before the judge, his head bowed in shame. The prosecutor laid out a case with precision, citing the dashcam footage as irrefutable proof of Ethan's actions. "This officer abused his power," the prosecutor said. "He violated the public's trust, and he targeted an innocent man solely because of the color of his skin. This is not just a crime against Captain Mensah, it's a crime against justice itself." Ethan's defense attorney made a feeble attempt to argue that his client had acted out of stress and poor judgment, but the evidence was too strong. Judge sentenced Ethan to probation and community service, along with mandatory participation in bias awareness programs. As the gavel struck, Kofi felt a sense of closure, not because Ethan had been punished, but because the truth had prevailed. In the months that followed, Kofi worked tirelessly to implement meaningful changes within the precinct. He introduced a comprehensive bias awareness training program, mandatory for all officers, and established regular community police dialogues to foster trust and understanding. One of the most impactful initiatives was the creation of a mentorship program for young recruits. Kofi personally took on several mentees, including Officer Sifu, a bright and ambitious rookie who shared Kofi's passion for justice. During one training session, Sifu approached Kofi with a question. "Captain, do you really think we can change the culture of this department? It feels so ingrained." Kofi smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Sifu's shoulder. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Sifu. It's a process, one step at a time. But if we don't believe it's possible, then we've already lost. You're part of that change. Never forget that." A year after the incident, Kofi stood on a stage at a community event celebrating the progress that had been made. The atmosphere was festive, with music, food, and laughter filling the air. Kofi addressed the crowd, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "This journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. We've proven that when we come together, as a community, as allies, as human beings, we can create real change. This is just the beginning, and I am proud to stand with all of you as we continue this fight for justice." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the park. Kofi stepped back, his heart full as he looked out at the faces before him. He knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for the future. Months after the reforms had taken root, Kofi sat in his backyard with his wife Amma, watching their children, Ayo and Kojo, chase each other around the garden. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over their home, a sanctuary of love and resilience. Kofi sipped his tea thoughtfully. "Amma," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice, but I never thought I'd have to fight for it for myself. What happened with Ethan, it shook me. But it also reminded me why I do what I do." Amma placed her hand on his. "Kofi, you didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for this community, for all the people who couldn't speak out. You turned something terrible into something meaningful. That's what makes you the man I love." He smiled at her words, a rare moment of peace washing over him. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. At the precinct, the atmosphere had changed. Officers were more conscious of their actions, their biases, and their responsibilities to the community. The mentorship program flourished under Kofi's leadership, with young recruits like Sifu becoming shining examples of what law enforcement could be when guided by integrity and empathy. In the community, relationships with the police improved. Regular town halls fostered open dialogue, and residents began to see officers not as enforcers, but as partners in safety. The healing process was slow, but it was real. Kofi's efforts extended beyond the precinct. He was invited to speak at national conferences on law enforcement reform, sharing his story and his vision for a better future. His name became synonymous with accountability and change, inspiring others to take up the mantle in their own communities. One day, Kofi received a letter in the mail. It was from Ethan Wright. The handwriting was shaky, and the letter itself was brief, but the words carried weight. "Captain Mensah, I don't expect your forgiveness, but I needed to apologize. I betrayed your trust, my badge, and everything I thought I stood for. I've spent the past months reflecting on my actions, and I'm ashamed of what I did. I'm trying to make amends, but I know that may never be enough. I hope you can find it in your heart to understand that I am committed to being better, Ethan Wright." Kofi read the letter twice before setting it down. He didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but he appreciated the effort. It was a reminder that even those who falter can find a path to redemption, if they're willing to confront their mistakes. As the months turned into years, Kofi continued his work, knowing the fight for justice was never truly over. His children grew up hearing stories of their father's bravery and integrity, lessons that shaped their own values and aspirations. For Kofi, the journey wasn't about erasing the pain of what had happened, it was about building something stronger in its place. He had faced injustice and emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, more determined, and more hopeful than ever. "This isn't just my story," he often told his recruits and community members. "It's ours. It's about resilience, accountability, and the belief that we can always do better. So, what do you think? Could you have handled a situation like Captain Kofi Menzies with the same grace and composure? His story reminds us that even in the face of injustice, calm determination can create powerful change. What would you have done in his shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for more incredible stories of resilience, justice, and hope. Together, we can learn from these stories and strive for a world where accountability and fairness are the norm. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.